Hi everyone, welcome. The bins you see here in front of us have African nightcrawlers in them. The ANC is my abbreviation for that, and the bin on the bottom is now 17 weeks of age, 119 days, over which time it's received 8 feedings, and back then, 119 days ago, we went ahead and moved the worms into here, but held on to the castings that they'd been inhabiting previously, with the assumption that there were cocoons in there, and that's the reason we're running what we call a cocoon nursery here. And it was 11 days ago, during our last check-in of both of these, that we finally initiated this migration area. And the whole idea is to try to lure the worms out of the finished compost. I'm going to get these systems up on the bench, see how things are coming along, and I'm very curious to see how the migration's progressing. So let's get to work. We're starting down here in the nursery bin, where 11 days ago we initiated the migration, or attempted to migrate the worms that were inhabiting the material over into this feeding area. And the plastic is meant to keep the moisture content in, as opposed to the uncovered side just being left to continue drying. And I think it was that dryness that we predicted to be our greatest foe, working against us when the time came to migrate worms out of this stuff. I always had this feeling like, as long as this stuff over here is really damp and comfortable for the worms to be in, they're going to have very little reason to leave. I mean, I understand the idea of creating something that's irresistible and is going to attract them, and I do my best to make that happen on the migration side, but I've often done just that in very damp conditions and found very little response in terms of worm reaction. And the one thing that's always worked well is allowing the material to dry. I guess this is what makes casting special, I think, is what I'm feeling just by probing a little bit down into the material, scraping aside the really dry stuff on the surface. Right away you're faced with a bunch of stuff that's cool and damp, and after being this way for who knows how long, weeks if not months, you would imagine this stuff would be all bone dry, but it just magically hangs on to its moisture. So it does seem to me like all this dry stuff on the surface is a good candidate for being possibly buried down within the more damp stuff. So I'd like to inspect the castings, and at this point, if we determine that there's really no more worms left in this stuff to be migrated out, then we can start thinking about this stuff as being pretty much a batch of depopulated castings. And we did our best to try to reach that point where there was a good bit of dryness down here before trying to initiate the migration of the worms. And after 11 days, who knows, this might have already been done after a couple days if we had come back in here sooner. But I do believe that what I'm seeing, at least on this end, the far end furthest away from the horizontal migration feeding zone, I feel like I'm seeing stuff that's pretty much absent of any worm activity or presence. I see nothing, absolutely nothing, and the castings are just really nice. I love how fine they are and how they just break apart, even though some of them are a little clumpy, and I guess a quick sifting would separate a lot of this stuff out, all these little pieces of bedding bits. Let's get this dry stuff down low and sort of bury it under this more damp stuff. It might help it a little bit, or at least dampen it if nothing else. And I guess as we make our way closer, maybe we'll still see some worms, I don't know. I think we might be done here. It'd be nice if we can kind of just add this material to my collection of finished castings. And at some point I might actually run it through a screen just to capture all the little bits and pieces of stuff that didn't get fully broken down and get it back into service. So here I saw one worm kind of hanging out right on the edge, but it did seem like part of them was underneath this divider and pretty much disappeared over to the good side, out of the bad side, out of the dark side. Here's one that's fully over in the dark side, but the only one I've found so far over in the black gold. So let's upgrade them to some nice new Some nice new accommodations on the other side, but I really see no other worms. And you know, when I pulled back some material from this divider, that one little guy that was sort of completely over on this side may have been also partially underneath the dividing wall here. But like I keep saying, there's really no intention of dividing anything from anything. It's the reason I punch all these holes into these things, so that it's really easy for worms to get through it, under it, whatever they want to do. But I believe we're at that point where we can just haul out what's in here and place the castings into storage, or at least set them aside for a little while until I can get my screen out and maybe try to capture a few bits and pieces of stuff that could still use some extra time breaking down, but that's kind of boring, and I'll do that offline, I believe, at some point. Here we've got who knows how many worms. You know, this, don't forget, this started out as a batch of what we had at that time perceived to be more or less depopulated castings after we hauled them out and migrated them into their new home. So what we're collecting here is theoretically maybe a few stragglers that sort of evaded that process of me rounding them up and hauling them out, but I would imagine that the vast majority of whatever's in here is going to be attributable to the nursery action. So I'm just trying to get a sense of how big this thing is and how big of a container we need to get these little guys out of here if they don't all freak out and try to escape on me like this little guy here is trying to do. Get back in the bedding, buddy. So let me get something we can haul this material out with gracefully. And we're going to be relocating it with the with today's feeding over into the adult bin, and this will be a done nursery and a batch of finished castings. Awesome. Oddly enough, one of the most important tools I find is having a little side container, you know, that you can use to do little haul outs and storing things. A little convenient size like this. This little dollar store crystal tray thing is also awesome. It's what I use next to my coffee machine to put used coffee stuff and kitchen scraps into until such a time that I've got time to either feed them to worms or stow things away into the freezer storage. And just down here, it's a little bit bigger, I believe, and has just great utility function. So here we are. We're going to be adding whatever worms we've collected here, mainly baby worms, I believe, to an existing system that already has an estimated population of over 2,000. So I took some notes before coming down here from my spreadsheet. According to our estimates, the system has a little bit over 2,030 worms from when we launched it off. And every time we do anything that could change that figure there, such as add worms from here to there, it's always useful, I believe, to get input from the viewers to see what everyone thinks in terms of how many worms they saw. I mean, most people have heard or seen examples of how you got like a jar full of jelly beans or whatever, and when you take the estimate of like 100 different people and you average it, you get almost an exact perfect correct answer on the number of jelly beans that were in the jar. So some people provide very, generous estimates. Some people will provide much more conservative estimates. But when you average it all together, when you've got a large enough sample size, number of people contributing their input, then you have a really good chance of getting a very, very accurate number. So I'm just being a little bit, I guess, hands-on here with these little guys, because I know I'm encountering some stuff that seems like it just kind of turned into like a little boulder here, all dried together, stuck together. So there's no worms there, but there's other spots where there's good little pockets of moisture and worms hanging out. So the worms knew what to do over the past 11 days. After we set up that nice little comfortable spot for them to come over to, they did just that. And now we're going to reunite them with their parents. Because theoretically, these are all juveniles. Juveniles that were all born right here. Wow, good numbers of them too, look at that. And when we release them, I'm not sure how good of a view of them we'll get. But at least here we can sort of check them out now that they've come over for the party. We can take a quick glance at how many of them have come out. And at some point, I guess that point is now, I'll be turning to you guys as the viewers to give me your ideas as far as how many worms did you think we hauled out of here. Oops, look at this little itsy bitsy baby. Stay with the crowd, buddy. So here I just want to make sure, make sure this little guy doesn't sort of make his way back over into the finished castings. We don't have any refugees. Refugees? Is it a refugee or just like somebody who refuses to leave anymore? It's not so much a refugee, it's just somebody who ended up not going with the rest when the evacuation alarm sounded. And I mean, if you were a worm still stuck in that finished castings, and I doubt there are any because I saw not a sign of anything in there, then, you know, the dryness maybe won't get much worse because I'll probably just combine that with other African nightcrawler castings that I have in a bucket in my storage collection. And then it'll preserve its moisture pretty good because I keep that somewhat ventilated but pretty well covered to prevent unnecessary drying of the stuff. And here I think we've got the entire contents of the horizontal migration feeding zone. We'll set this aside so we can put away the castings, you know. As long as we're setting up a feeding zone in the other system, we could use this stuff as bedding or something else. It'll come in handy. And as far as this is concerned, oops, here's another straggler. Let's not leave anyone behind. Maybe I will just take a little pause here, shut the camera off, and just take a moment or two to make sure we haven't left anyone behind here. And I'll just take this system and get it out of our way, and soon we'll be back to feed the adult bin as well as add more worms to them. Release those little babies we just looked at, and here the tag comes off because we're done. So let's continue on to feeding momentarily, but that'll be after I take a short break. I'll be right back. Yeah, you know, I mean, just as I was fetching this bin, it occurred to me how it really did seem to me as if a nursery bin should work pretty much just like what we saw there, you know? And I think the rough equation is give time for the cocoons to hatch, then give time for those babies to grow a little bit larger, and then during that, use that as the opportunity to get the material to gradually become something that those worms would be happy to leave if there was something better offered, to put it mildly. To me, that just seems the right answer to that is let it dry, you know, let it become a little bit dry, not hostile dry, dangerous dry, but let it dry, and then the worms will be happy to come over to a nice damp feeding area that you set up for them. All right, now we're starting to see a little movement. I saw one over here, one over there. Just pulling back this really dry stuff, try to see if we can take that out of the picture to assess what's really going on under the covers. I mean, those papers that you saw covering things up here, not doing much in terms of keeping the moisture in the bin. So they allow for a little bit of evaporation, but it seems to be just the right amount. For a system this age, 17 weeks old, 119 days, there is a pretty high concentration of mainly castings, pretty much, I think. Stuff really does a great job hanging on to its own moisture. Here and there I could see bits of bedding mixed into the stuff everywhere. Worms too, everywhere. Looks pretty good. I tell you, the feeding they got last time I looked at the video was yummy stuff. All kinds of delicious foods placed right down the middle for them. So let's see what they've done with that over the past 11 days. If there's really 2,000 worms in here, there could be, I don't know, there could be very little leftovers of it. We must have been pretty generous on the bedding in that last feeding. I could see a worm or two. And an object like this mango seed, this will go back way before the last feeding, many feedings ago, many weeks ago. back to the early ancient days of the bin. So the bedding that was added to the system 11 days ago with the food is something you would definitely expect to see. Very slow composting objects like a mango seed, all stuff that you would expect to see as leftovers. But I'm not really seeing anything that resembles the types of foods they were given last time. I think there were pea pods. Those things I thought would be gone pretty quick. I believe those are kind of high on the list of faves for the wormies to eat. Here I just sort of encountered a little bit of a jumble of bedding type materials. It was stuck to what's left of another mango seed. This one's a little bit further along than the other one, as you can see. And it's not because I've tried to help it along or crush it. It just sort of falls apart on its own, because I do like to just leave those things to go on their own. Even if it takes a really long time, I think it's just more interesting to watch as it breaks down on its own. Yeah, you know, I was contemplating what to do here as far as the nice bedding layer I like to put underneath my feedings. I mean, you could always add a little bit more fresh, but I think that this old stuff right here that we scooped up off the top surface, regrettably getting neglected because it's a little bit drier than the rest, is the stuff that deserves to be right down there, I believe. What do you think? I believe that seems like the right answer. And man, we're doing pretty good in this bin, I think. Except, you know, here and there I'm going to have a worm or two that doesn't appreciate the very hands-on nature of my check-in, which is just par for the course around here, I guess. But yeah, let's start making this real in terms of getting the food in here, because it did seem like a good amount of stuff. And I feel like we've already laid in a bedding layer. To add more, I feel like might put us into overload mode here. So let's get the food in at least, and make sure we got enough stuff to cover up with. Besides all that recycled bedding, we've also got that thing that was serving as sort of a partition wall in the migration there. So that's a pretty good size hunk of cardboard too that'll be going in here as bedding. So maybe we don't have to sweat the bedding on this go around, because it does seem like there's a good amount of it on tap here, mixed in amongst these chunks of food items. The middle of this thing might be so frozen that I can't break it apart, but no, it seems like to be, yeah, okay. We don't have to get it too minute. I think this should work. Leave that more husky stump right there in the center. Looks like a good feeding so far, right? But now if we plop in this little hunk of carbon supplement to go hand in hand with their feeding, I think they're going to like it even more. Perhaps even some of this stuff that's been depopulated by worms just diving down to get away from me. That stuff will also do right nicely down here, I believe. If we bring a worm with us doing this on the way, doesn't matter. These are those tubes that we had in here as like spacers in a way. But now we're getting down to where there are wormies in this stuff, so we'll leave them be for the official launch. So I think as part of leveling off, we're just going to continue across, because we didn't get a chance to see how things look under the covers on this edge. So this will give us that full pan across the entire system. Man, is this stuff nice. Moisture level, everything seems perfect. Good amounts of worms hanging out in it all over the place. Yeah, here and there some of this bedding is mixed in, which is perfect. Give them stuff to play with over there as well. But now we're at that point, I suppose, to level things off. I mean, I had I had already set aside my grit. Oh, took off the lid. I set aside my, that's not the grit, that was the worm chow. This is the grit. So I had both of these on standby to include with the feeding, but it looks like we've sort of passed that point of no return. I don't know. Sometimes you just feel like, hey, you know what? If you missed it, then just live with it. Don't have to like undo what you've done to make up for a missed step. The worms will survive if they don't get worm chow with this feeding. I mean, all those veggies that they just got, I think they're going to be quite happy with that for a while. So we're good on that end. And as far as the grit goes, I believe my generosity with grit in most feedings is sufficient to make sure that the system's probably got plenty of grit in here, so we won't have to worry about that. In fact, I think I even used a good bit of grit when we set up the feeding zone for these guys, but we don't have a whole lot left to do here other than let these little guys loose and cover them up when we're done. So let's get that taken care of and we'll be done here. But don't forget, I'm really looking for some input on how many worms we've got here, so please don't forget to reply. And what is all that? Are those pot worms I'm seeing on the plastic? I believe so. Well, I'll fish out stragglers from the plastic, but I just want to get this mound leveled off. So they've all got direct access to the material below, so they could all scurry out of view and protect themselves, but this will also give us a little bit of a insight into how many worms this nursery yielded. So please don't forget to comment. Give me your estimates. How many worms are we releasing in here now? Very curious to hear. I think I've already got a number in mind. Well, that was fun, but we're more or less done. But I keep looking at this and this, thinking, you know, what's the harm of just giving it to them in a way that I actually saw done on another channel where the stuff was accidentally left out, and as an afterthought, right before covering up, I'm seeing all kinds of shrapnel and little bits of paper and bedding and all kinds of things down here that I think the worms will be happy to come up and nibble on if we show them that there's also stuff like this to come get. So I think this is going to create a really nice top layer here, you know, because we're not going to come back and find leftovers of this, I don't think. I think what we're going to find is the residue left behind by the worm traffic, a whole bunch of nice fresh castings, at least, well, that's what I'd like to hope that we're going to see down in here when we come back. But who knows, that might be another week, might be another 10 days. This time it was 11 days, and it seemed to be a pretty good amount of time. I mean, you saw how much stuff we gave these guys, but there's also a pretty good number of worms in here, at least I think there is. And I think it's more or less an agreement too, because those numbers we throw around are, like I said, everyone's input, not just my ideas. So that's it for today's video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and if you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. Alright everyone, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.